My name is Delilah. I'm 38 years old. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside the city, the kind of place where the lawns are trimmed on Saturdays and the mailboxes all match. I've been married for 12 years. I wear my wedding ring every day, not out of habit, but out of belief. Or at least, I used to. People usually describe me the same way: sweet, patient, low maintenance, at work. I'm the steady one, the reliable one. I manage operations for a mid-sized nonprofit, which means I fix problems before anyone notices they exist. At home, I was the emotional air filter absorbing tension before it spread. I remembered birthdays. I scheduled dentist appointments. I noticed when the pantry was low, when someone's tone shifted, when something felt off. And somehow no one noticed me. This isn't a dramatic story. There was no screaming, no shattered glass, no affair discovered in a flurry of late-night messages. There were no villains in dark corners plotting against me. What happened to me was quieter than that. I begged my spouse to notice me while wearing a wedding ring. I asked in small ways, reasonable ways. I asked with softness, with patience, with the benefit of the doubt. Marriage didn't protect me from feeling invisible, unwanted, and emotionally abandoned. And that's a strange thing to admit out loud, because on paper, everything looked stable. We had a home, shared finances, shared history, shared holiday photos, smiling at a camera that couldn't capture what was missing. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about catching someone in the act or delivering a dramatic speech in a rainstorm. It's about something far more unsettling: what happens when you slowly disappear inside your own life and then one day realize you don't have to. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how invisibility doesn't happen all at once. It happens in inches, in interruptions, in being spoken over, in being thanked but not seen, in being useful but not valued. And I'm going to tell you about the moment I stopped asking to be noticed and started becoming undeniable. Not louder, not crueler, just immovable. If you've ever felt unseen by the very person who promised to see you forever, if you've ever wondered whether love is supposed to feel this lonely, tell me, have you ever felt invisible while standing right next to someone who swore they loved you? Before I understood that I was invisible, I thought I was appreciated. That's an important distinction. My husband, Aaron, used to describe me as solid. He meant it as a compliment. If someone asked what kind of woman I was, he would say, "Delilah's the dependable one. She holds everything together." His friends would nod. My in-laws would smile warmly at me across the dinner table as if I were a particularly well-trained golden retriever. Dependable. Steady. Low drama. Those words followed me everywhere. At work, it was the same. I was the person who stayed late without announcing it, the one who rewrote proposals quietly when someone else made mistakes, the one who smoothed over conflicts so thoroughly that no one ever realized there had been tension in the first place. I built a life on being frictionless, and frictionless things don't get noticed. They get used. In the early years of our marriage, I didn't question it. Aaron was ambitious, charismatic, and a natural center of gravity in any room. I admired that about him. I didn't need to compete for attention. I preferred observing from the edges anyway. Or at least I told myself I did. At parties, I refilled drinks and listened. If I started a story and he interrupted with a louder one, I would pause and smile. If someone asked about my work, he would answer for me. "She basically runs the place," he'd say, laughing, and the conversation would pivot back to him before I finished a full sentence. I convinced myself that this was a partnership. He shone outwardly. I stabilized inwardly. But here's what I didn't realize over time. People stopped asking what I thought. They asked what I could do. "Delilah, can you handle the reservations? Delilah, can you check the numbers? Delilah, can you call the contractor? I was the solution, never the subject. Even in my own home, decisions would arrive pre-made. Aaron would say things like, I figured we'd refinance, or I told my brother he could stay with us next month, as if my agreement were assumed. And I would nod, not because I lacked opinions, but because disagreement felt like unnecessary disruption. I had trained everyone, including my husband, to believe that I was endlessly accommodating. The truth was, I thought love meant making yourself easy to live with. So I swallowed small disappointments. Like when he forgot the anniversary dinner reservation but remembered a client's golf schedule in detail. Like when I bought a new dress and stood in front of him for a full 10 seconds before he looked up from his phone and said, "Oh, is that new?" Like when I reached for his hand in bed, and he shifted slightly, not rejecting me, just not noticing. It wasn't cruelty. That's what made it harder to name. It was an absence. I wore my wedding ring every day. I would twist it sometimes when we were out together, a quiet signal to myself. This means something. We mean something. But meaning requires recognition, and slowly I began to understand that to them, to my husband, to our friends, even to my colleagues, I wasn't a woman with inner weather, shifting needs, and a pulse of desire. I was infrastructure, necessary, reliable, unseen. And the most dangerous part, I believe that was enough. The first small cut didn't look like a wound. It looked like a joke. We were at a dinner party hosted by one of Aaron's colleagues, polished hardwood floors, soft jazz in the background, wine poured generously into thin-stemmed glasses. I had spent the afternoon preparing a lemon tart from scratch because I'd heard his colleague's wife loved citrus desserts. I remember smoothing the top carefully, wanting it to be just right. When we arrived, Aaron placed a hand at the small of my back and guided me inside like a well-mannered escort. I smiled. I always smiled. At some point during dinner, the conversation shifted to career ambition. One of the guests, a woman in a sharp navy blazer, asked me directly, "So, Delilah, what's next for you? Any big plans?" I opened my mouth. Aaron answered, "She's already doing what she's best at," he said lightly, swirling his wine, keeping everything from falling apart. There was laughter around the table, warm laughter, harmless laughter. I forced a small one, too, but something in me stalled. The woman looked back at me politely. "Waiting?" I tried again. "I actually just finished restructuring our departments, and she won't tell you," Aaron interrupted with a grin, "that she practically saved their budget last year. She's humble like that." It sounded like praise. But praise delivered over someone's voice doesn't feel like admiration. It feels like erasure. The conversation drifted away before I finished my sentence. Someone asked Aaron about an upcoming deal. Glasses clinked. The lemon tart was served later and complimented enthusiastically. "Delilah, you're amazing," the host said. "Aaron's lucky." I remember looking at him when she said that. Lucky. He smiled proudly. "I know. That was the first small cut. Not because he insulted me. He didn't. Not because he dismissed me cruelly. He didn't. It was because he positioned me as a supportive background instead of a person moving forward in my own right. And he did it so smoothly that no one, including me, felt permitted to object." On the drive home, I brought it up carefully. "You answered for me a lot tonight," I said softly, watching the streetlights pass in rhythmic intervals. "I was hyping you up," he replied immediately. "You're overthinking it." That phrase, overthinking it, it landed heavier than it should have. I just wanted to finish what I was saying. I tried again. "You're sensitive tonight," he said, not unkindly. It was a good evening. Don't turn it into something. And because I didn't want to be the woman who turned things into something, I let it go. That's how small cuts survive. They're wrapped in plausible explanations. He didn't yell. He didn't mock me. He didn't demean me outright. He reframed my absence as humility, but that night, when I stood at the bathroom sink removing my earrings, I studied my reflection longer than usual. I tried to remember what I had been about to say at the table, the specifics of the project I was proud of. I couldn't fully recall the ending of my own sentence. That unsettled me more than the interruption itself, because invisibility doesn't begin with others ignoring you. It begins when you start editing yourself in anticipation. I told myself it was minor, a social rhythm, a married couple's dynamic. Still, something had shifted. The next morning, I reached for his hand at breakfast and noticed he was already scrolling through emails. I watched him for a moment, waiting to be looked at. He didn't look up, and for the first time, I wondered, if I disappeared for a day, not physically, just emotionally, would he notice the difference? The cut was small, but I remembered it. After that dinner, nothing dramatic changed, which is exactly how it continued. If he had done something undeniably cruel, I would have had something solid to confront. But what I faced instead were patterns so subtle they could be mistaken for coincidence. He began finishing my sentences more often. At first, it happened in public. Then it slipped into private moments. I was thinking maybe we could order Thai. Yeah, that's fine, he'd say, not looking up, except I wasn't going to suggest Thai. Or I'd start to share something about my day, a small victory at work, a conversation that lingered with me, and halfway through, his phone would light up. He wouldn't leave the room. He wouldn't even explicitly disengage. He would just drift, and I would lower my voice, then shorten the story, then eventually say, "It's not important." That phrase became my reflex. It's not important. What unsettled me most was how easily I participated in my own minimization. If he forgot to ask how my presentation went, I told myself he was stressed. If he canceled a date night because a colleague needed him, I told myself that was adulthood. If he responded to my vulnerability with logic instead of curiosity, I told myself that's just how some men communicate. I built explanations faster than he built neglect. And because there were still kind gestures, groceries picked up without asking, my car filled with gas, a quick kiss on the forehead before bed, I felt almost ungrateful for wanting more. But the erosion continued. One Sunday afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing our finances. Numbers have always calmed me. They're honest. They don't pretend. Aaron walked in and glanced at the spreadsheet. "You're good at that stuff," he said casually. "I don't know what I'd do without you." It was meant to be affectionate, but something in me translated it differently. You're good at managing. You're good at supporting. You're good at holding. Not leading, not desiring, not needing. Just maintaining. I started noticing how often I was described in functional terms. Reliable, organized, calm, low maintenance. No one ever said passionate or compelling or ambitious. Even when I achieved something significant, securing a major grant at work, restructuring an entire operational model, it was framed as an extension of my helpfulness. "You're such a team player," my supervisor said. And at home, when I mentioned the achievement, Aaron smiled distractedly and said, "That's great, babe," before pivoting into a story about his own upcoming meeting. The shift wasn't loud enough to protest, but it was steady enough to feel. And here's the part I'm not proud of. I began to preempt the dismissal. If I had something to share, I'd rehearse it in my head and simplify it, trimming away details so it wouldn't take too long. If I felt hurt, I'd measure it against some imaginary scale of what qualifies as legitimate pain. It doesn't qualify. He's not cheating. He's not cruel. He works hard. You're lucky. That word again. Lucky. Marriage, I had always believed, meant being chosen daily. But I began to feel like furniture selected once and expected to remain stable indefinitely. One evening, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror, holding my wedding ring between my fingers. I rarely removed it. But that night, I slid it off and studied the pale indentation on my skin. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want a different life. I just wanted to feel seen inside the one I had. So I put the ring back on, and I told myself this was normal, that long-term love becomes practical, that passion settles into logistics, that invisibility is simply maturity. I normalized the ache, because naming it would require admitting that something sacred was quietly thinning, and I wasn't ready for that yet. There's a moment, subtle but irreversible, when you realize you're no longer being misunderstood. You're being categorized. For me, that moment arrived on an ordinary Wednesday evening. Aaron's brother had come to stay with us temporarily, just a few weeks. Aaron had said he needs a stable place to land. I agreed without hesitation. Stability was my specialty. That first week, I reorganized the guest room, stocked the bathroom with fresh towels, and adjusted my morning schedule so everyone could shower without conflict. I added his brother's favorite cereal to the grocery list. No one asked me to do those things, but everyone expected them to be done. One night, the three of us were sitting in the living room discussing plans for the holidays. Aaron and his brother were debating where the family gathering should be hosted. They went back and forth, calculating travel times, discussing logistics. I waited for the natural pause. It never came. Finally, I said gently, "If we host here, I'll need at least a week's notice to coordinate the catering and sleeping arrangements." Aaron didn't look at me. He just nodded at his brother and said, "See, she's got it handled." Got it handled. Not, "What do you think?" Not, "Is that okay with you?" Just assigned. The decision was made in that instant. I was in operations. I was infrastructure. I was the silent executor of other people's plans. Later that night, as I loaded the dishwasher, I heard them laughing in the living room, loud, easy laughter. I realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to articulate before. They didn't see me as someone whose comfort needed protecting. They saw me as someone whose competence made protection unnecessary. It sounds like strength, but it feels like isolation. Over the next few weeks, I began observing the dynamics more carefully. At gatherings, if there was a logistical question timing, reservations. Travel eyes turned to me. If there was an emotional check-in, someone upset, someone uncertain, I was subtly expected to mediate. But if there was a bold idea, a risky move, a leadership decision, that belonged to someone else. I had been cast in a role I never auditioned for, the reliable one. Reliable women are admired, but rarely pursued, rarely surprised, rarely prioritized. One Saturday morning, I tested something small. Aaron was making coffee, scrolling through his phone. I stood beside him and said, "I've been thinking about applying for a leadership fellowship. It would mean traveling a few times this year." He paused just long enough to register the information. "That's great," he said. "We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out." As if my ambition were a scheduling inconvenience. As if the primary question was how it would affect the ecosystem I maintained. He wasn't malicious. He simply operated within the role I had demonstrated so consistently. I absorbed impact. I adapted. I made room. And somewhere along the way, I had stopped requiring room in return. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet. Because I understood something uncomfortable, roles persist because they are reinforced. And I had reinforced mine for years. I had mistaken self-sufficiency for invulnerability. I had confused patience with self-erasure. And now, everyone, especially my husband, treated me accordingly. That night, I lay in bed beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. I placed my hand lightly on his chest, not to wake him, just to feel proximity. He didn't stir. I wasn't rejected. I was simply unconsidered. That was the role, not unloved, not betrayed, just perpetually secondary. And for the first time, instead of trying to fix it, I asked myself a quieter question. What would happen if I stopped performing reliability so flawlessly? The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after a dramatic confession or a slammed door. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a grocery store parking lot. I had just finished work a long meeting where I'd presented a restructuring proposal that would save our organization nearly $500,000 over 3 years. The board had asked sharp questions. I answered everyone calmly. When it was over, the chairwoman looked at me and said, "Delilah, this was exceptional. You're operating at the executive level." Executive level? I remember sitting in my car afterward, hands still on the steering wheel, letting that sentence settle. Operating at the executive level. And yet, in my own home, I was treated like a background function. Not because I lacked value, but because I had allowed my value to be interpreted only through service. I pulled into the grocery store on autopilot. Inside, I walked the aisles slowly, adding items to the cart: spinach, coffee filters, paper towels, the ordinary inventory of a stable life. As I reached for a carton of eggs, my phone buzzed. "Aaron." "Hey," he said when I answered. "Did you remember to call the insurance company about the deductible?" "No, hello?" "No. How was your presentation?" "Just a task." "Yes," I said. "I handled it yesterday." "Perfect. Knew I could count on you," he replied. I stood there, staring at the rows of identical white cartons. "Knew I could count on you." It was meant to be reassuring. Instead, it landed like confirmation. He didn't need to check in emotionally because I was structurally dependable. He didn't need to notice me because I never disrupted the system. And suddenly, something inside me clarified, not in anger, but in precision. I realized I had been begging quietly, not with dramatic pleas, but with subtle offerings, cooking his favorite meals, reaching for his hand first, saying, "Is everything okay?" when he seemed distant, initiating conversations about connection in a tone so gentle it could be dismissed as a mood. I begged my spouse to notice me while wearing a wedding ring. And the ring, I understood now, was symbolic, not protective. Marriage didn't protect me from feeling invisible, unwanted, and emotionally abandoned, because protection requires participation from both people. Standing in that grocery aisle, I felt something unfamiliar. Stillness, not sadness, not fury, just a clean internal line being drawn. I finished shopping. I drove home. I put the groceries away. I made dinner. Nothing outward changed that evening. But inwardly, I stopped asking. Not out loud, not dramatically. I simply stopped volunteering emotional labor that went unreciprocated. When he came home and launched into a story about his day, I listened, but I didn't over-validate. I didn't lean forward eagerly. I didn't fill the silences with follow-up questions. When he asked what we should do about an upcoming family event, I said, "Whatever you think makes sense," and left the planning untouched. Not passive-aggressively, just neutrally. For the first time, I allowed a little space to remain unfilled, and what I noticed startled me. He didn't immediately step into it. The silence stretched. He assumed I was tired. He assumed I was busy. He assumed everything was fine. That night, as I lay in bed, I didn't reach for him. I folded my hands over my own stomach and stared at the ceiling. I wasn't withdrawing love. I was withdrawing automatic accommodation. And in that quiet, something solidified inside me. If I had the capacity to operate at the executive level in every other arena of my life, why was I accepting entry-level emotional treatment at home? That question didn't ignite a fight. It ignited a strategy, and strategies don't announce themselves. They begin in silence. In the past, my silence had been compliance. Now, it became observation. There's a difference. When I stopped over-functioning emotionally, I expected friction. I expected Aaron to ask if something was wrong. I expected at least mild confusion. Instead, there was comfort. He seemed relaxed. Less emotional processing from me meant fewer conversations about connection, fewer gentle check-ins, and fewer moments where he had to examine anything beyond logistics. At first, that realization stung. Then it educated me. I began running a quiet experiment. When he came home and vented about work, I listened, but I didn't problem solve unless he asked directly. When he forgot to confirm plans with his family, I didn't follow up. When his brother left dishes in the sink, I left them there. Not as punishment, as data. What I discovered was unsettling in its simplicity. The system recalibrated without protest. If the dishes piled up, Aaron eventually noticed, not immediately, but eventually, if a reservation wasn't made, he handled it at the last minute. If a family member needed clarification, they called him instead of defaulting to me. Nothing collapsed, which meant one uncomfortable thing. I hadn't been indispensable. I had been convenient. That truth didn't break me. It freed me. For years, I had equated love with being essential. If I am needed, I am valued. If I hold everything together, I matter. But what if being needed isn't the same as being seen? One evening, Aaron glanced at me from across the couch. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I looked up from the book in my hands. "Have I?" "Yeah, just different." I held his gaze calmly. "Different how?" He hesitated, searching for language. "I don't know. You just seem less invested in the small stuff." The small stuff, translation, the invisible maintenance. I've just been focusing on my own priorities, I said evenly. He nodded, as if that were reasonable. And the conversation ended there. No curiosity about what those priorities were. No follow-up question. And in that moment, I understood something critical. People grow accustomed to the version of you that requires the least from them. If you never demand emotional presence, they won't practice it. If you never assert a boundary, they won't search for one. My silence was no longer hopeful. It was strategic. I began redirecting energy inward. I stayed later at the office, not to avoid home, but because I genuinely wanted to expand my influence there. I signed up for the leadership fellowship I had mentioned weeks before. I didn't ask if it was okay. I simply informed him once I was accepted. "Oh," he said, "that's sooner than I expected." "I'm looking forward to it," I replied, and I meant it. There was a new steadiness in me, not colder, just clearer. At night, when we lay in bed, I no longer reached first. I didn't recoil either. I simply stopped compensating for his inattention. And here's what fascinated me most. He didn't notice the shift in depth, only the shift in availability. One Saturday morning, he asked casually, "Can you take care of booking my flight for next month?" I looked at him over my coffee cup. "I'm sure you can handle it," I said softly. Not sharp, not sarcastic, just factual. He blinked, mildly surprised, then nodded. Yeah, of course." The world didn't end. The sky didn't crack, but something invisible tilted. For the first time, I wasn't performing quiet devotion. I was choosing measured presence, and in that choice I felt power, not the loud kind, not the destructive kind, the kind that comes from realizing you can step back, and everything continues. Silence had once been my way of keeping peace. Now it was my way of gathering clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to understand, changes everything. When people think of preparation, they imagine visible action. Lawyers, spreadsheets, secret phone calls. My preparation looked nothing like that, at least not in the beginning. It looked like attention. Once I stopped filling every silence, I had more time to observe what had always been there. Patterns became clearer when I wasn't emotionally entangled in correcting them. I noticed how often Aaron spoke about our plans when the benefit tilted toward him, and how often he used I when discussing accomplishments. I noticed how quickly he responded to colleagues' texts, and how slowly he replied when I sent something vulnerable. I noticed that when I stopped initiating intimacy, weeks could pass without him acknowledging the distance. And most importantly, I noticed my own reactions. There was no sharper sting. There was an assessment. I began documenting quietly, not out of spite, but out of habit. I've always been meticulous with information, at work. I track metrics, timelines, and patterns of inefficiency. At home, I had never applied that same clarity. Now I did. I opened a private journal, digital, password protected, not to catalog grievances dramatically, but to record reality. Dates, conversations, decisions made without consultation, moments I expressed a need and the response I received. Seeing it written stripped away ambiguity. It wasn't catastrophic. It was consistent. And consistency matters more than intensity. At the same time, I turned my attention toward myself in a way I hadn't in years. I met with a financial advisor under the pretense of optimizing investments, which was technically true. I wanted to understand every account, every asset, every shared liability with precision, not because I had decided to leave, because I needed to know that I could. There's a difference. I increased my contributions to my personal savings account subtly, legally, responsibly. I reviewed our insurance policies. I made copies of important documents and stored them securely. If you had looked at my life from the outside, nothing would have appeared unusual. Dinner was still made on some nights. Laundry was still folded. Family gatherings were still attended. But internally, I was recalibrating. One evening, during my leadership fellowship orientation, we were asked to define our long-term vision, not professionally, but personally. The facilitator said, "If no one else's expectations existed, what would your life look like?" The question sat in my chest long after the session ended. If no one else's expectations existed, would I still be negotiating for emotional crumbs? Would I still be explaining away absence as busyness? Would I still be shrinking my voice to maintain harmony? That night, I didn't journal about Aaron. I journaled about myself. What I wanted. What I valued. What I refused to normalize any longer. And here's the part no one noticed. My posture changed. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. But when Aaron spoke over me at a small gathering weeks later, I didn't fall silent. I waited. And when he finished, I said calmly, as I was saying, the table quieted just enough for the shift to register. He glanced at me, slightly startled. I continued my thought without apology. No confrontation, no tension, just completion. He didn't comment on it afterward, but I did. In my journal, I wrote, "I no longer disappear mid-sentence." Preparation isn't always about exit. Sometimes it's about alignment. I was aligning my external behavior with my internal truth, and the more aligned I became, the less tolerable the invisibility felt. Not because I needed validation, but because I had rediscovered self-recognition. What they never noticed was this. While they assumed I was simply less invested in the small stuff, I was investing elsewhere. In clarity, in independence, in options. And options are quiet power. I wasn't planning an explosion. I was building the ability to walk calmly away or stay from a position of choice rather than fear. For the first time in years, I wasn't asking to be seen. I was ensuring I could see myself clearly. And once that happens, you can't unlearn it. Leverage doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, almost disappointingly so. There was no dramatic discovery, no hidden account, no secret betrayal uncovered in the middle of the night. The reveal was simpler than that. It was the moment I realized I did not need Aaron in order to survive the life we had built together. For years, I had operated under an unspoken assumption that our stability was mutual and therefore inseparable. That the house, the finances, the rhythm of our days were too intertwined to ever stand independently. But when I met with the financial advisor, a calm woman in her 40s with precise glasses and a voice that didn't waver, she walked me through our portfolio line by line. "You're more than stable," she said, "individually and jointly." Individually, the word lingered. I asked hypothetical questions. If assets were divided evenly, if retirement accounts were restructured, if the property were sold, she answered without judgment, without curiosity about my motives. Just facts. Facts are clarifying. On the drive home, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. For the first time, The narrative in my head shifted from, I hope this gets better, to, I can leave if it doesn't. That shift is subtle, but it changes your posture. Over the next few weeks, I reviewed everything with calm precision. Insurance beneficiaries, property titles, digital passwords. I ensured my name was properly attached to what it needed to be attached to. Not secretly, responsibly. I wasn't hiding money. I wasn't orchestrating revenge. I was confirming reality, and reality said this: I was not trapped. The deeper reveal, however, wasn't financial. It was emotional. One night, Aaron fell asleep on the couch while watching television. I turned off the screen and stood there for a moment, looking at him. 12 years of history. Vacations, illnesses, shared grief, shared laughter. I waited for a surge of panic at the idea of losing it. Instead, I felt something quieter: gratitude and distance. I realized I had been afraid of the wrong thing all along. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of being unseen forever. And those are not the same. The wedding ring on my finger suddenly felt symbolic in a new way. Not as proof of commitment, but as proof of a promise that required maintenance from both sides. I twisted it slowly, feeling its familiar weight. If I removed it, I would survive. If I kept it on without change, I would diminish. That was the leverage. Not money, not documentation. Choice. When you know you can leave, you stop begging to stay. And once you stop begging, your energy shifts in ways other people feel even if they can't articulate why. Aaron began asking small questions again. Are you okay? You seem busy lately. Everything good at work. Surface curiosity, not depth. And because I now knew I could walk away cleanly, I no longer chased depth from someone unwilling to go there voluntarily. I answered honestly, but briefly, yes, I'm focused. Things are progressing. He interpreted my steadiness as contentment. He mistook emotional withdrawal for peace. What he didn't understand was that I had reached a decision threshold internally, not about divorce yet, but about dignity. The private reveal was this: I no longer needed him to change in order for me to be okay. And once that truth settles into your bones, everything becomes optional. Love becomes a choice again. Staying becomes a decision, not a default. I didn't celebrate that clarity. I respected it, because clarity doesn't shout. It waits for what you'll do next. There's a moment when preparation turns into choice. Not impulse, not emotion, choice. For weeks after my private clarity, I moved through our home like someone observing a familiar place from a slight distance. Not detached, just evaluating. I watched how Aaron responded when I stopped anticipating his needs. I noticed whether he leaned in when I didn't initiate connection. I paid attention to whether curiosity about me resurfaced organically. It didn't. He adapted to the quieter version of me the same way he had adapted to the accommodating one. That was the final data point. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my journal open. I wrote 2 columns. Stay, leave. Under stay, I wrote what would have to change, not theoretically, but concretely. Mutual emotional effort. Uninterrupted conversations. Shared decision-making. Intentional intimacy. Active curiosity. Then I asked myself a harder question. Has he demonstrated the capacity for this without being managed into it? The answer was uncomfortable. No. Not because he was incapable as a human being, but because he had grown accustomed to a marriage that functioned without him needing to stretch emotionally. Under leave, I wrote what I feared: loneliness, disruption, disappointing family. Starting over at 38, then I wrote what I would gain: self-respect, alignment, the possibility of being fully known even if only by myself. I closed the journal and sat very still. Here's what surprised me. The fear of staying felt heavier than the fear of leaving. Staying meant negotiating for visibility indefinitely. Leaving meant uncertainty, but also integrity. The irreversible option wasn't divorce itself. It was reclaiming my standard. Once you articulate a standard internally, you cannot unknow it. That night, Aaron mentioned casually that he'd committed us to hosting Thanksgiving. "We'll figure it out," he said, familiar and automatic. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a villain, not a monster, but a man comfortable in a system that benefited him. And I realized something sobering. If I stayed without redefining the system, I would be complicit in my own erasure. So I made the decision quietly. I would no longer remain in a marriage where emotional invisibility was normalized. Whether that meant radical change within it or walking away from it would depend on his response to truth. But the truth was coming, not in the form of an ultimatum, in the form of clarity. The next morning, I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney, not to file immediately, to understand the process, to understand the timeline, to understand consequence. As she outlined what separation would entail: asset division, mediation, paperwork, I listened calmly. There was no trembling in my hands, just focus. When the meeting ended, she said, "You seem very composed." "I've had time," I replied, and that was the decision point. I wasn't acting out of hurt. I was acting out of accumulated recognition. The version of me who begged to be noticed while wearing a wedding ring had dissolved. In her place stood someone who understood this. Love without presence is proximity, not partnership, and I would no longer confuse the two. I walked to my car afterward and sat for a moment before starting the engine. There were still multiple paths ahead: reconciliation, separation, reconstruction. But one thing was irreversible now. I would not shrink again to maintain comfort. Whatever came next would be chosen, not endured. Once a decision forms internally, action doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to be deliberate. I didn't confront Aaron the day after meeting with the attorney. I didn't announce that I was reconsidering everything. I didn't cry in the kitchen or rehearse speeches in the mirror. I began moving in silence. First, I opened a separate checking account in my name, only not to hide money, but to redirect my direct deposit. A portion at first, then a little more. Everything legal, everything traceable. I wasn't siphoning. I was stabilizing. Next, I updated my professional documents resume. LinkedIn, certifications, not because I planned to relocate immediately, but because independence requires readiness. If I needed to shift cities, accept a new role, or renegotiate my housing situation, I wanted leverage. At home, nothing looked different. I still cooked dinner some nights. I still attended social gatherings. I still wore my wedding ring. But internally, I had stopped leaning my future against someone else's emotional availability. One evening, Aaron mentioned casually, I might take a bigger role at work next year. More travel. In the past, I would have immediately calculated how to absorb the shift. Logistics, holidays, emotional gaps. This time, I simply said, "That sounds like a significant change." He nodded. "It'll be good for us." For us? The phrase landed differently now. I didn't argue. I didn't challenge. I just observed that he was still planning forward as though the system remained intact, and I let him. Meanwhile, I gathered documents, tax returns, mortgage agreements, retirement summaries, and stored digital copies in a secure cloud folder under my control. I scheduled another meeting with the financial advisor to model post-separation scenarios. I learned exactly what selling the house would look like. There's something powerful about understanding worst-case outcomes. They lose their ability to intimidate you. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There were no racing thoughts at 2 a.m., no panic spirals, just clarity. Aaron began sensing a shift, not in what I did, but in how I did it. "You seem really focused lately," he said one night. "I am," I replied, on what he didn't ask. The silence between us grew less anxious and more revealing. Without my constant emotional calibration, the gaps were visible. Dinners were quieter. Weekends are less curated. He occasionally looked at me as if trying to measure something intangible. But because I wasn't accusing, he had nothing concrete to defend against. That's the quiet power of preparation. It doesn't provoke. It positions. One afternoon, I removed my wedding ring while washing dishes and left it on the counter longer than usual. Not symbolically, not theatrically, just absent-mindedly. Aaron walked past it twice before noticing. "Hey," he said lightly, "you forgot this." He picked it up and handed it to me. Our fingers brushed. For a fraction of a second, I wondered if he felt the same weight I did. I slid it back on without commentary. "I didn't forget," I said softly. He didn't press further. That moment told me everything I needed to know. He noticed the object, not the shift behind it. And so I continued, quietly meeting with advisors, quietly building savings, quietly preparing timelines. No one around us would have guessed a recalibration was underway. That's the thing about emotional independence. It doesn't require external validation. It requires internal alignment. And by the time I was ready to speak openly, I wanted my actions to already reflect my words. Because once spoken, truth changes the air in a room, and I intended to speak it only once. The consequences didn't begin with paperwork. They began with absence. When you remove a silent support beam, the structure doesn't collapse immediately. It shifts, subtly, unevenly. Aaron was the first to feel it, though he couldn't name it. It started with small inconveniences. A dinner reservation he forgot to confirm. A birthday gift for his mother was purchased on the day of, instead of being thoughtfully planned in advance. A missed email about a neighborhood meeting that I would have normally flagged. None of these things was catastrophic, but they accumulated. One evening, he walked into the kitchen looking mildly irritated. "Did we ever confirm Thanksgiving catering?" he asked. "No," I replied evenly. "I assumed since you committed to hosting, you had a plan." He blinked. "I thought you were handling it." "I wasn't aware that I said, not sharply, just clearly. There was a pause, not hostile, just unfamiliar. "Oh," he said. "Okay, I'll take care of it." And he did, late, expensively, a little stressed. I didn't rescue him. That was new. The house felt different, too. Not colder, just less curated. When his brother left laundry in the dryer for 2 days, I didn't fold it. When Aaron mentioned he was out of clean gym shirts, I said, "The washer's free." He adjusted, but slowly, and with a faint undercurrent of discomfort. What he was feeling wasn't abandonment. It was exposure. For years, my constant anticipation had shielded him from friction. Now he was meeting ordinary adult responsibilities without a buffer. One Saturday, we attended a friend's gathering. In the past, I would have managed introductions, remembered names, and filled conversational lulls. This time, I stood beside him, present but not facilitating. At one point, he turned to me quietly and said, "You're being really quiet tonight." "I'm just listening," I replied. There was something in his eyes then, not accusation, not anger, uncertainty. Later that week, he asked, "Are we okay?" It was the first time the word we felt like a question instead of an assumption. "I think we've been functioning," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure we've been connecting." He frowned slightly. "Where is this coming from?" "It's not new," I said. "I just stopped smoothing it over." He leaned back in his chair, processing. "I didn't realize you were unhappy." That sentence was honest and devastating. Of course, he didn't realize. I had packaged my dissatisfaction so neatly that it never disrupted his comfort. The consequences were no longer logistical. They were relational. Without my constant emotional calibration, he was beginning to sense a gap he didn't understand how to close. But here's what mattered. I wasn't expressing this to provoke panic. I was expressing it because the truth had matured enough to be spoken calmly. Over the next few days, he became slightly more attentive. He asked how my fellowship was going. He lingered in doorways a little longer. He reached for my hand in the car, not dramatically, but noticeably. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to wonder, is this the beginning of repair? But attention born from discomfort is not the same as transformation. I wasn't looking for reactive gestures. I was looking for sustained presence. The consequences had begun, not explosive, not theatrical, just a quiet realization on his side that something foundational had shifted, and on mine, an even quieter understanding. Awareness doesn't guarantee change. It only opens the door. Whether he would walk through it or whether I would walk out was still unfolding. Awareness came to Aaron gradually. Urgency came later. After our first honest conversation, the one where I said we had been functioning but not connecting, he made efforts. Small ones at first. He asked about my fellowship sessions and listened a little longer before redirecting the topic. He suggested a dinner out, chose the restaurant himself, and even made the reservation. He began saying we more intentionally, as if the word could stitch something back together by repetition alone. From the outside, it might have looked like an improvement. From the inside, it felt reactive. I wasn't moved by gestures anymore. I was measuring depth. One night at dinner, he reached across the table and said, "I feel like you've been slipping away from me." It was the first emotionally precise sentence he'd offered in months. I held his gaze. "I've been asking to be seen for a long time," I said quietly. "You just didn't notice." His jaw tightened slightly. "Why didn't you say something?" "I did," I replied softly. He looked genuinely unsettled. That was the moment the panic began, not loud, not frantic, but visible in the way he leaned forward, the way his questions became sharper. "Are you thinking about leaving?" he asked. There it was, the fear. I didn't answer immediately, not to manipulate the silence, but because I wanted the truth to land cleanly. "I'm thinking about what it would mean to stay exactly as we are." I said, "That's not fair." He said, a flicker of defensiveness rising, "We can work on this." "We could have," I replied gently, "for years." He fell quiet. Panic doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like someone realizing they've misread the stability of their own life. Over the next week, his efforts intensified. He initiated intimacy more deliberately. He sent thoughtful texts during the day. He asked deeper questions, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes sincerely. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. The version of me who craved those gestures had already grieved their absence. When you mourn something slowly over time, you don't revive instantly when it reappears. One evening, he found me reviewing documents at the dining table, financial projections, timelines, and notes from my attorney consultation. He didn't see specifics, but he saw enough. "What is that?" he asked carefully. "Information," I said. "For what? For options?" The word hit harder than an accusation ever could. He sat down across from me, his composure thinning. "Are you seriously considering ending this?" "I'm considering ending the version of this where I don't exist emotionally," I said. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen during stressful negotiations at work. "I didn't know it was that bad." "I know," I said, and that was the tragedy. He didn't know because invisibility doesn't scream. It adapts. The truth was, by the time he felt urgency, I had already found equilibrium without him. Not anger, not hatred, just independence. He began suggesting counseling, retreats, and restructuring schedules. He spoke of resetting priorities, and I believed he meant it. But intention born from fear is different from awareness born from empathy. I wasn't punishing him. I simply could not unlearn the clarity I had gained. For years, I had begged quietly while wearing a wedding ring. Now, standing at the edge of leaving, I realized something sobering. It's not that he couldn't change. It's that I had changed first. And sometimes, by the time someone understands what they're about to lose, the loss has already happened internally. The final conversation didn't happen in a therapist's office. It happened at our kitchen table on a Sunday morning. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no ultimatums written on napkins. Just two adults sitting across from each other with 12 years between them. Aaron had made breakfast, something he rarely did unless prompted. The gesture wasn't lost on me. Neither was the tension in the room. He folded his hands together. I scheduled a consultation with a couples counselor. He said, "We can start next week." I nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." But he pressed. "But I've already been in counseling," I said calmly. His brow furrowed. "You have." "Yes, individually. For months." That landed quietly but heavily. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because for a long time, I was trying to fix how I felt without making you uncomfortable." He leaned back, absorbing that. "I never wanted you to feel alone," he said. "I know," I replied. "You just didn't notice when I was—" There was no accusation in my tone. Just a fact. He rubbed his temples. "So what are you saying? That it's over?" I let the silence stretch, not strategically, just honestly. "I'm saying I can't stay in a marriage where I have to negotiate to be seen." I said, "And I don't think we know how to rebuild that from where we are." He stared at the table, then back at me. "I love you," he said, voice steady but thinner than usual. "I don't doubt that," I answered. That was the hardest part. There was love here, but love without attention had slowly become insufficient. "I thought we were solid," he said quietly. "We were stable," I corrected gently. "That's not the same." He exhaled, long and slow. "Is there anything I can say right now that would change your mind?" It wasn't desperate. It was sincere. I considered the question carefully. "No," I said, not because I was punishing him, but because decisions built over years don't reverse in a single conversation. I needed consistency, not urgency. I continued, and by the time urgency arrived, I had already adjusted my life to function without it. He nodded faintly, as if something was finally aligning in his understanding. "So this is really happening," he said. "Yes." No heat, no spectacle, just inevitability. We discussed logistics after that mediation, timeline, telling family. The conversation shifted into practical territory almost seamlessly. Two competent adults outlining the dismantling of a shared structure. At one point, he looked at my left hand. "You're still wearing it," he said softly, glancing at my ring. "For now," I replied. I wasn't clinging to symbolism. I was honoring the transition. When the conversation ended, he didn't argue. He didn't accuse me of being dramatic or selfish. He stood, walked around the table, and pulled me into an embrace. It was familiar, warm, and somehow already part of the past. As he stepped back, I realized something unexpected. There was no bitterness in me, just relief. Confrontation doesn't always require volume. Sometimes the strongest position is calm certainty. And in that kitchen, without raising my voice once, I reclaimed something I had been negotiating for years, my presence. It has been 11 months since that Sunday morning. The house was sold in early spring. The paperwork was methodical, almost clinical. Mediation instead of litigation, division instead of destruction. We did not become enemies. We became separate. I moved into a smaller place across the city, a third-floor apartment with tall windows and uneven wooden floors that creak in certain spots. The first night there, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, I expected to feel panic. Instead, I felt quiet, the kind that belongs to you. For years, my identity had been intertwined with stability. The reliable wife, the steady presence, the one who made things work. Now, when people ask about me, the answers are different. I still work in operations. In fact, I was promoted shortly after the separation, not because I left my marriage, but because I had already been operating at that level for a long time. I travel occasionally for the fellowship network. I speak more in meetings. I finish my sentences without apology. But the deeper shift isn't professional. It's internal. I no longer measure my value by how smoothly I can absorb discomfort. I no longer confuse being needed with being known. On some evenings, I sit by the window with a cup of tea and reflect on the woman I was the one who begged quietly while wearing a wedding ring, hoping someone would look up and really see her. I don't judge her. She loved deeply, She believed in patience. She thought endurance was maturity. But endurance without reciprocity becomes erosion. Aaron and I speak occasionally logistical updates, mutual friends, brief check-ins. There is no hostility. Sometimes there's even warmth. He once told me he's in therapy now. I didn't understand what you meant back then, he said during one conversation. I do now. I believe him, and I'm glad he's learning. But growth that arrives after separation doesn't retroactively repair what was neglected. It simply marks evolution. I don't wear my wedding ring anymore. The indentation on my finger faded faster than I expected. What surprised me most wasn't the absence of a partner. It was the absence of tension. I sleep more deeply. I laugh more easily. I make decisions without calculating someone else's emotional bandwidth first. And here's the truth I didn't know I was capable of holding. I don't regret loving him. I regret shrinking myself to maintain the version of love we had. Now, if I sit across from someone at dinner and they interrupt me, I say calmly, let me finish. If I feel unseen, I name it early, not with accusation, with clarity, because who I am now is not louder, not colder, not hardened. I am simply unwilling to disappear, and that difference changes everything. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a dramatic moral, something sharp, something triumphant, but the truth is quieter than that. There was no revenge, no courtroom showdown, no final speech that shattered anyone's pride. There was just a woman who slowly realized that invisibility, when tolerated long enough, becomes a lifestyle. And she decided not to live that way anymore. I begged my spouse to notice me while wearing a wedding ring. Not loudly, not desperately. Just in the small, dignified ways that many of us do by cooking carefully. By reaching first. By asking. Are we okay in a tone that tries not to sound like a threat? Marriage didn't protect me from feeling invisible, unwanted, and emotionally abandoned. Because a ring is a symbol. Presence is a practice. What I learned is this. Love is not proven by stability alone. It's proven by attention, by curiosity, by mutual effort. And if you find yourself constantly translating your needs into something softer, smaller, more convenient, just to keep the peace, that peace may already be costing you too much. Leaving wasn't about punishing him. It was about refusing to punish myself any longer. Some people will say I should have stayed and fought harder. Others will say I should have left sooner. But growth doesn't follow public timelines. It follows private clarity. And clarity comes when you stop asking, how do I make this work, and start asking, does this honor who I am? If you're watching this and you feel unseen in your own relationship, I'm not telling you to leave. I'm asking you to look honestly at the pattern. Are you being loved in the way you need? Or are you being appreciated for how little you require? There's a difference. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I want to leave you with this. Have you ever mistaken stability for intimacy? And if you're honest with yourself right now, are you being truly seen? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.